Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment, the podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Bryan Ward with me. Bryan is a former Marine, and then also now he works in the banking industry, but also one of his main things is the Dad Up podcast. And so, really excited to talk to Bryan today. And I think one of the things that you're going to hear is in his pursuit of being a great dad, one of the things he wanted to do was then help other people in their journey as well. So, Bryan, thanks so much for being on today.
Thank you very much for having me, brother. I appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this and excited. Happy New Year to you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this. So yeah, my journey's kind of been a roller coaster, but it's been fun, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
I love it. Well, to start your story, talk a little bit about, growing up. I know as you were growing up, you kind of realized school wasn't going to be something that you really wanted to enjoy. And so your dad ended up saying, hey, you might need to pay rent if you want to stay at the house. But talk a little about, your relationship with your parents and what that looked like.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. My parents, to this day, over 50 years still together. And my mom, she had me at a very young age. She was 16 when she had me, and I was pretty much raised my first 4 or 5 years by my grandparents because my mom was, still in school and trying to work. And but as I grew up, my parents worked a lot of jobs. They're blue collar workers. They're retired now, thankfully, but they're blue collar workers. They worked several jobs. Sometimes my mom had 3 jobs at one time. She had a cleaning service. She worked at a party supply store, and then during the evening time, she'd go to her cleaning service and run that business, where it was her own business. But I spent a lot of time raising my sister, who's 5 years younger than me. Spent a lot of time raising her, but at the same time, I wanted to try to have as much of a childhood as I could. In that, I played sports. I started working at a very young age. I started working, doing babysitting jobs first, but really got my very first job as a paper boy. If you're probably too young to remember that.
No, I had one too. I had one too.
Okay, well, I had a paper out, and we lived in a very small town. It consisted of about maybe 800, 900 people, and I had one side of the town, and my best friend had the other side, and we were the only two paper guys in the town, and we used to compete against each other. But that's how I made my money when I was a very young teenager, and I played sports all through high school. And one thing that resonated with me, with my parents and their relationship with me, was that because they worked so much and because they spent a lot of time trying to make sure they were providing for me and my sister, I never saw them. So I went to practices and games. I got rides from my friends' parents because I didn't have a ride. Sometimes the coaches would pick me up, and I was the kid that was out on the court, or I played baseball, basketball. I was on the swim team. I was on the water polo team. I was on the wrestling team. But I was that kid that was out there that had no one in the stands watching him, except for people that I didn't know. My family wasn't there, and I can count on one hand, Phil, how many times my parents have actually been to a game that I played growing up, and that affected me because it's one of the things that I tell dads now is that, or tell parents in general, is that look at your kids when they're out on these playing these sports, doing these extracurricular activities, and they look up in the stands, they look out in the crowd, and they see the people cheering. They don't care about any of those people. All they want to see is you, somebody that's there to represent them. And I didn't have that, and I knew at a very young age that was not going to be me as a parent. If I was going to I originally didn't want to have kids, but if I was going to have kids, I was going to be that dad that was always involved. You're going to have to fight me off to get me to not be around my kids when they're doing their stuff. So my relationship with my parents was strained at the time, at times, because I kind of did hold grudges towards them because they couldn't be there as much as I wanted them to. I didn't understand. I was a kid, right? But now, I mean, my relationship with my parents is good. It's not 100% great, but it's good. And I still communicate with them, every week. I still talk to them and see them as much as I can. They live a few hours away from me, but see them as much as I can. And hey, as we grow up and we have trials and challenges that we go through as kids, we have to understand that once you become a parent, you see exactly what your parents went through. Raising my boys, I understand now what my parents went through just trying to provide for me and my sister. So that's kind of a synopsis of how my relationship was with my parents growing up. And it had a direct impact, a direct reflection of how I raised my boys.
I love it. Now, something I want to, dive into on that topic is someone listening right now has that parental wound, right? They haven't forgiven, they haven't given grace, they haven't moved past that. It still kind of holds on to them. And I think, there's a lot of different issues that can come from a child and parent relationship. But one of the things, if you truly believe it is, hey, they did the best they could at the spot that they were right at that time. And, it's not as if your mom had an easy hand in regards to, you had a son at a younger age. You had to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. And so I think oftentimes when you look back on it, only with time can you say, wow, I'm sure that was hard, and you put yourself in those shoes. But talk a little bit about that for someone that's the child trying to work through that emotional relationship, and maybe they had an absent or maybe a less than present parent that they would have liked.
Well, everybody's story is different, Phil. I think that everybody goes through their own challenges and faces their own challenges and deals with them in the way that they think is best for them. But what I would say to parents, maybe that or maybe the man out there that doesn't quite have a family yet, that maybe had that kind of that wound with his own family or his own parents, listen, you only have them for so long, and sometimes you have to try to figure a way to make it work. And if that means trying to rebuild or reconnect that relationship with them, my relationship with my dad wasn't always the best. And there were times that we had to really sit down and talk about it because, I had him on my show and we talked a little bit about it when he was on my show because I didn't understand it. But as I grew up, I started to understand it. And so for you as parents out there, you need to find a way to help your kids understand the relationship that you had with your family, and make sure that that type of relationship that you had with your parents doesn't impact your kids in a negative way.
That's good. Now, as your story continues and you get older, you end up joining the Marine Corps. And talk a bit about, how you decided to do that, and then also talk about you thought you were going to be going to the jet mechanic school, and they end up pivoting you into something else.
Right. That's a whole funny story. Interesting enough, as I said, I played sports and I worked. And when I got out of high school, my parents both, my mom graduated high school. My dad actually didn't graduate high school. He actually had to go back and get his GED. But neither one of them went to college. No one in my family actually went to college. And I was going to go to college. I got out of high school, started going to community college, and realized school's just not quite for me. I realized that I wanted to take a break. I was working a lot of hours. I was working at a grocery store, and I worked a lot of hours, and I made really good money for an 18-year-old. I was making really good money because I didn't mind doing all the hours. I didn't mind working the extra overtime. I was working double shifts just because I enjoyed making the money. And so I told my dad, I said, hey, I think I'm going to take a break from college. I know that I had only been in a couple months. And I said, I just want to take a break on school. I've gone my whole life. I just want to take a break, focus on working, enjoying life a little bit. And maybe in a semester or so, maybe next year sometime I'll go back. But for right now, I just want to focus on working. And he said, okay, that's great. But you're living in my house. And the rule was you were supposed to go to school, and as long as you were going to school, you could live here. But since you're not going to go to school anymore, then if you're going to continue living here, then you need to pay rent because you want to be an adult and you want to do those things. You're going to live the adult life, then you're going to have to pay rent. Yeah. And I thought, well, that's kind of not the way I wanted this conversation to go. So I worked at a grocery store, and the manager of that grocery store was actually in the Marine Corps, and I was kind of mentioning to him about, trying to find my way as far as not really wanting to go to school, and he had suggested I take a look at the military, and I had no interest in the military. I had no interest whatsoever, but I thought, you know what, maybe I will go down to the recruiting office and just kind of talk to the guys. And I went down, my interest was the Air Force, and I went down to the Air Force recruiting office and was talking to the guy. And I went back to my manager and told him how excited I was that I was going to go into the Air Force. And he said, no, you're not going into the Air Force. I went, what do you mean? And he said, no. There's only one military group that you need to be a part of, and that's the Marine Corps. And so I'm only letting you go into the military because I worked for him, right? I'm only letting you go. I was part of a union. I'm only letting you go if you go into the Marine Corps. And so I went down and talked to the Marine Corps recruiter and decided that was it. I thought, hey, I grew up my life working on cars. This guy says I can be a jet mechanic. That's awesome. That sounds cool. I think my parents will be happy about that. So I went back, told my dad, you know what, Dad, I don't have to pay your rent. He said, why? And I said, because I'm going in the military. And I kind of thought it would kind of catch him off guard a little bit. And he said, that's awesome. So that conversation didn't go as planned either. So he said, that's awesome. I'm proud of you. My mom was just the opposite. She said, no, you're not. Because this was right after Desert Storm. So my mom was not super thrilled about me taking that decision. But there I was signing up for the military. I went into the Marine Corps and got to Tennessee after boot camp. Got to Tennessee for my jet school, jet mechanic. And sitting in the room with a bunch of other new military guys, new Marines. And the captain in there said, hey, who's here? Raise your hand if you're here for jet mechanic. And 90% of us raised our hand. And he said, okay, you can all put your hands down because you're no longer going to jet mechanic school. And now you're going to just work in the air wing and you're going to work on flight gear. And I thought, no, I'm not. I signed up for the jet mechanic. I wanted to be a jet mechanic. That's what I'm going to do. And he said, unfortunately, the jet mechanic school is 6 months long, a 6-month waiting list, and we don't have time to have you sit and wait. Yeah. It costs too much taxpayer money to have you sitting around and wait, so we're going to assign you a different job, and you're going to be working with flight gear. Now, what that means is you're still going to be working in the air wing, so you're still going to be part of that division, but you're going to be working on all the equipment that all the pilots use for safety reasons, whether it's their parachutes, their life raft, their gear that they wear, all that, their helmets, all that kind of stuff. You're going to be working on that stuff and making sure that stuff's in working order for them to be able to function properly. And I'll never forget it, Phil. I went back to the barracks, got on the phone, the pay phone, because we didn't have cell phones, got on the pay phone, called my dad and said, hey, I need you to get a hold of my recruiter because I want out. And he said, okay, what's going on? I told him. He's like, all right, I'll make some phone calls. I'll get a hold of your recruiter. Well, recruiting jobs are only about 6 months long unless you continue to, keep doing them. But the recruiting job is typically only a 6-month job. And by the time I had went in and got into my school, he was already gone and he was already back at his original duty station. And I had no clue where he was or what he did other than recruiter. And so I was stuck. So I actually considered going AWOL, told my dad I was coming home. And he said, no, you can't do that because they'll arrest you. They'll throw you in jail. You don't want to do all that. You just got to stick it out and figure it out. So long story short, I spent 4 years in the air wing working on flight equipment. And honestly, it was probably one of the best decisions for me because it helped me build the relationships that I have now. And I'm still friends with some of the guys that I was in that division with to this day. And you know what? It is what it is. I did my 4 years and got out and couldn't be more proud. Actually, I'm wearing a Marine Corps shirt now. So.
Absolutely. Now, as you were in, if I understand correctly, your third year, you end up meeting your would-be wife. And as you guys started a family, there was some times where you had just, been having a couple beverages and you had asked your sons to grab you a drink from the fridge and you decided maybe that's not the route that I want to go down. So talk a bit about, why that was so impactful for you and how, you kind of came to that realization that, hey, this just isn't the route that I want to be showing for my son.
Yeah, you do your research. I like to joke, and you've probably heard me say it, but I like to joke. In the Marine Corps, they teach us 3 things: how to cuss, how to drink, and how to fight, or how to kill. And one of the things that I took away from the Marine Corps after I got out was drinking. It was just something that I naturally still did. I still had beverages, I still had drinks, cocktails, beers, whatever. And I wasn't a drop, I wasn't like just a flat out drunk. Wasn't one of those guys, but I was a social drinker. And even when I'm sitting at home at night, just kind of hanging out, relaxing, I would have some beers or I would have some, glasses of wine or maybe a cocktail. And it got to be a little bit too much, where I was just enjoying it maybe a little bit too much. I didn't do things like drinking and driving. I wasn't like belligerent with my family. I wasn't, none of those kinds of things. I was working in corporate America. I still had I still participate, I did as much as I could in corporate America. None of that impacted my job, nothing like that. I was a coach, I coached my boys all growing up and didn't drink while I was coaching them. I was responsible. Let's just say, Let's put it that way. The one thing I wasn't responsible with was controlling it at home. And I had grown up in an alcoholic family. Both my parents were alcoholics. My wife grew up in an alcoholic family. Her dad was an alcoholic. And I had one night where I was just like, this is just too much. I had, like you had shared the story that I asked my almost 10-year-old son to grab me a beer out of the fridge, and he brought me a beer, and something hit me. It was like doom, just a punch right in the chin, where I was just like, wait a minute, what in the hell am I doing? I'm teaching my boys about alcohol just by the simple notion of having them get me a beer. I'm teaching them that it's okay to just kind of do this as much as you want. And I knew that was wrong. And so I told my wife, I said, hey, I'm thinking about getting rid of the alcohol and thinking about getting rid of, no more drinking for me. And she said, I think that's a great idea. I've been meaning to talk to you about it. So she had already had it on her schedule to sit and talk to me about it, thinking it was getting too much. And so it was that very moment. I just said, no, I'm done. I put it down, and over 15 years later, I'm still completely sober and free and loving it. And I got to say, we just passed New Year's Eve and New Year's Day and all that, and my wife and I were relaxing, watching the Rose Parade on the TV, just kind of chilling. And my wife said, it's so funny that you bring this story up, because my wife said, can you imagine all the people right now that did a little bit too much partying last night and how terrible they feel right now? And I said, and that's exactly why I don't care that I quit drinking 15 years ago, because I am just fine waking up completely, not hungover, all that stuff. So yeah, and it's something I'm proud of. I talk about it on my show a lot. It's not something that I'm ashamed of. It's just something I'm proud of. And my boys to this day will still thank me for giving up drinking.
Yeah, I love it. Now, as you were raising your sons, like you said, you love sports, you end up starting to coach them. And I think, that the player, coach, player, parent dynamic can be hard for people to navigate, like, hey, when I'm on the court with them or I'm in the weight room with them, I'm trying to be a coach, but then, walk off the court and now I'm in the car with them and now I'm dad, I'm not coach. How did you kind of navigate that through your time of, being a dad and a coach, in those situations and, helping kids understand, hey, I'm saying this maybe from a point of being a dad, or, hey, I'm saying this from a point of being your coach, and having them understand that.
Yeah, it was just a hard rule that I had with my boys. It was one of those things where, when my boys were little, it was okay to just be their coach. And you know what? Most little kids, they don't really fully understand the scope of sports and all that. You're just there to kind of teach them the basics, teach them the fundamentals of learning the sport that they're playing in. So there wasn't really any of that struggle between dad and coach. But it's as they got older and started to understand the sport and then understand the difference between a dad and a coach, that's when I really had to lay down the rule and say, listen, when we're out on the field or we're on the court, you cannot be calling me dad. You can't be asking me to do this for you. You can't be asking me that if you could start in the game because you're my son. I'm not part of that. That's not part of my equation as a coach. Yeah. I keep that stuff separate. It used to upset my wife, because my wife would be like, why isn't our son starting? Well, what do you mean, why isn't our son starting? He hasn't proven to me that he should start. Yeah. He's your son. I don't care. I'm not showing favoritism, period. If I'm going to coach, this is how I'm going to coach. I'm going to show even level playing field for all the players on the court, regardless of who they are. And that was just the way that I wanted to coach. And there was I saw a lot of coaches out there that was what we other coaches called daddy ball. That's all it was. It was daddy ball. Let me put my son out there as much as possible. And I had no problem with my son not starting. I had no problem with my son being benched. None of that stuff affected me because I was the coach, and my boys understood it. There was no dad on the court. There was no dad on the field. When they talked to me, they referred to me as coach. Promise you, Phil, if you were to ask my boys right now, they're 26 and 23, if you were to ask them right now how their relationship with me was as a coach, they were like, well, he was my coach. He wasn't my dad. He was my coach. I mean, that's how it was. When we got in the car and we drove home, I would take off that coach hat and I would put the dad hat on. And they could talk to me and ask me questions and want me to give them my opinion. And I would give them my opinion as a sidebar as a coach, but really give them my opinion as their dad and say, well, this is what I think you should do. There were several tips and several strategies that I implemented for them or had them implement to help them kind of exceed a little bit more than what most kids would probably do. I'll give you a couple of examples. Number one, I told my boys at the end of every practice and at the end of every game, I want you going up to each one of your coaches and I want you thanking them. And then I want you to ask them, what can I do between now and the next practice, or what can I do between now and the next game to help improve my game? What could I do? What could I implement? I had them do that every single time that they got done with a practice or a game. Yeah. When we were in a game, I always told my boys, make sure when you're on the court or on the field and you go to the bench that you're sitting as close as you can to the coach, period. Yeah. Because when the coach looks down the bench to see who he needs to put in, he's going to look and he's going to see your face right there. So your face is going to shine in his mind, and he's more than likely going to put you in first. That was just little different strategies like that. And I always told my boys, be the last one out. Yeah. Period. Be the last one out. If the coach tells you to leave, you need to leave. Be the last one out. Don't let anybody else be staying there playing late or hanging out and shooting or dribbling and all that kind of stuff, and you're the first one out the door because the coach wants to see who's really dedicated. And so, that's how I implemented it. That's how I worked as a coach for my boys.
I love it. Now, obviously, you mentioned earlier, hey, when I was playing in my sporting events, I was looking to the stands and, my parents weren't able to come very much. And you almost had the almost exact opposite, right? not only were you there, but you're able to coach. And just talk about why that was so important to you to be able to be there at so many of their events, especially knowing the backstory of your upbringing.
Yeah, that's why. It was the backstory of my upbringing. I knew that I wanted to be the dad that was always involved. And my role as a dad didn't start when they were born. My role as a dad started when my wife was pregnant. I was the one participating in all her doctor's appointments. I was the one participating in all the silly, and most husbands don't like this, but all the silly kid clothes shopping and all that kind of stuff. I was the one that was doing that with my wife. I went to every single one of her doctor's appointments. I was the dad that was putting my face on her belly and talking to my boys when they were inside her belly. I wanted to be that kind of dad because I didn't see that in my own parents. I didn't see that in my own dad. And I didn't want my boys growing up without that kind of that influence in their life. So coaching just kind of naturally happened because my boys, they're boys. They're very active boys. They naturally gravitated towards sports. And so it just kind of came easy. It's not something that I had anticipated on doing. I wasn't planning on coaching, but I remember walking up to the table at Little League when my older son was 4 years old and signing him up for Little League. And I was excited to watch him play Little League. He knew how to play because I was working with him in the front yard even at 4 years old. But I had no idea how to coach. Back then, YouTube wasn't even a thing. It was barely getting started. And so I didn't know where to go even to learn about coaching. And I walked up to the table, signed him up, and the guy at the table said, hey, you want to coach? And I said, nah. And he's like, really? I go, yeah, dude, I know how to play baseball. I know the rules behind baseball, but I have no idea how to coach. And he goes, bro, they're 4. They're going to freaking play with grass and chase butterflies. Don't freaking worry about it. Just teach them how to throw a ball and run the bases. You ain't got to do nothing else. Yeah. And I said, all right, well, maybe I'll assistant coach. And he's like, fine, be an assistant coach. So I signed up for the assistant coach. And of course, just my luck, this is the way God operates. But the head coach couldn't head coach. He had to he was doing his work or something got in the way. So he ended up not being able to coach at all. And I, being the assistant coach, had to step up into that coaching role. So that's kind of how my coaching journey got started, but it just manifested from there to where, my older son at the time was in college or about to get out of college, and my younger son was about to go away to college, and he had got a basketball scholarship to play in college. So he was playing basketball in college, but I was still coaching at the high school level because of the influence and the joy that I had in coaching these young men and being there for them almost like a father figure. So yeah, I mean, it's the impact that I knew that I would have on my boys. I knew that it would be everlasting. And my son, especially my younger son, talks about it all the time, that when he has kids, he's going to coach his kids in sports. And I believe that's because of the relationship that I had with him as a coach and dad for him.
I love that. Now, as you mentioned, as your kids end up, leaving the house, you almost feel, and I think this is probably very common for parents, a little bit of like, man, am I running out of time to be a parent, right? I'm kind of sending them off on this next journey. And so you speak with your brother-in-law about, that passion that you have for being a dad and wanting to help people, but feeling like there might be this void coming. And the suggestion is, well, maybe start a podcast. So talk a little about how the idea behind that came to be, and then really, the principle and the idea behind the podcast itself.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking. Are you familiar with my brother-in-law, Ed Milet?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So just want to make sure that that before my brother-in-law is Ed Milet, and it's interesting when my boys were growing up, and got to a point where they were about to what we like to refer to as leave the nest, and where my wife and I were going to be empty nesters. Phil, it was one of those things. I actually went through a bout of depression. Like, I had anxiety over them leaving, not because I was worried about them and what was going to take place in their life. They were very functioning young men. I wasn't worried in that sense. I was more worried for me because I knew nothing other than being a dad. That's what I knew. And that journey, I felt like, was coming to an end. I had done what I was supposed to do. I raised my wife. I should give my wife credit too, but we had raised two great young men, and now they're getting ready to go off and live their lives. And now I'm like, crap, what do I do next? What the hell do I do? This is all I've known, is being a dad. And I was talking to Ed. I was telling him, I'm like, dude, I'm freaking out. And he's like, what do you mean? And I was telling him, and he said, bro, he goes, one of the things that I respect most about you is how passionate you are about being a dad and how committed you were to being a dad. Why can't you help other dads? Yeah. And I was like, well, how the hell do I do that? And he's like, well, what? I mean, he had a podcast at the time. And I was like, he's like, what about a podcast for parents, for dads? And I was like, oh, I'd listen to podcasts. Obviously, I'd listen to his and all that, but I didn't know much about him. I didn't know really anything about him, how to run them, how to do them, any of that kind of stuff. And he said, look, all you got to do is just get some guys on the horn that are dads and talk to them about their journey. And maybe it'll inspire some other dads to step up their game as far as being a dad. And I thought, all right, I'll give it some thought. I'll kick it around. Came home, told my wife, and she said, that is brilliant. That's exactly what you need to do. That's your calling. You absolutely need to do that. So, it's interesting the way that when I think about that, it's interesting the way God lines up our life, because here I am, a kid who had a good childhood, not a great childhood, but had a good childhood, grew up with parents that were loving, that actually, my parents loved me to this day and love me, all that kind of stuff. But I grew up with parents that weren't involved, and it changed my life. It changed the trajectory of my life to where I was that kind of influence for my own boys. And then once that sort of ended, then it naturally transitioned into this role of podcast, where I was a podcast host for parents, for dads. And so it's interesting how God works. And obviously he had bigger vision for me when I was, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, wondering why my parents weren't there. He was telling me to just sit back and relax, because he's got a bigger vision in mind for me. And I had no idea at the time. But here we are like you, I'm over 5 years in and almost 300 episodes in, and my show's been featured on in publications, on radio. I've been on CNN. I've had a ton of guests on my shows from celebrities, athletes, entrepreneurs, authors, pastors, everyday people. My next door neighbor's been on my show. My wife's been on my show. My boys have been on my show. My dad's been on my show. I mean, it's just a vast array of people that I have on that want to talk about their life as a parent, because there's going to be somebody out there that's going to resonate with somebody's story and go, wow, I never thought about that as a parent, or wow, I didn't know I was having that kind of impact on my kids acting that way. I just interviewed a guy this morning. He grew up in a gang, ended up killing somebody, a rival gang member. He was a gang leader. This guy that I interviewed was a gang leader, ended up going to prison, grew up his whole life in juvenile hall, ended up going to prison and found God in prison, and it changed his life. He's out. He has 3 kids. He's living a productive life. They're making a movie of his life now, of his book that he has out. They're making a movie about it. And he just completely changed his life. And it's stories like that fascinate me, because the level of impact he has on his own kids now with just his own story and how it's impacted them. It's those kinds of stories that make other parents go, huh, I never thought about like that. I never thought I was acting that way, but I can see I was. I need to change this, or I need to fix this, or I don't have a relationship with my kids at all. Yeah. Like, my kids don't know me because I'm constantly working. Why am I spending 90 hours a week at the office and missing all these important events in my kids' lives? I just heard Phil and Bryan talking about their kids playing sports and looking up in the stands and not seeing their parents. That's me. I'm not there for my kid. And I just found out 2 days ago that my kid in his basketball game made his first 3-pointer ever, and I wasn't there to see it because I was so busy working. Yep. It's those kinds of things that hit me to the core, to where I go, this is why I do my show, because I want to help parents be better. I'm not saying, any parent out there watching this, I'm not saying you can't like devote your time to your career. You're trying to grow a business. I understand all that. You work in corporate America. It's tough. I get all that. But you need to make sure you're spending enough time with your kids, that you're showing them enough love and enough attention and enough appreciation and enough, you're just there enough to where that relationship isn't torn by the time they're grown and out of the house. Can you imagine, Phil, if I did not have that relationship with my boys growing up? I wouldn't have the relationship that I have now. They're 2 of my best friends.
I love that. Well, and I think one thing, speaking of Ed, one of his quotes that he says frequently is, we are most qualified to help the person that we once were, right? And I think, as you look at your story, you're helping the people, become parents like you wish you would have had, right? And I think that's so impactful. 1, because you know what it takes, but 2, because it's a passion. Anyone listening to you speak right now can hear the passion in your voice. Now, another spot, though, within parenting that I think is always interesting, and I've heard it explained this way, is almost looking at parenting as like seasons, right? Like there's a time frame, or there's a certain number of years where you need to be the parent, right? Like you're teaching rules, you're teaching right from wrong, like all those things. Then there's almost like a season where you're a mentor, right? Like, hey, I've been in your shoes, I've done that before, right from wrong. I'm just trying to give you wisdom and, help you maybe nudge in the right direction. And then there almost becomes a season where it's more of like a friendship. Like you said, hey, they're my best friends. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it, instead of, hey, I'm always dad. It's like, well, you'll always be their dad, right? But the role in which you play might change over time in how you parent. So talk a little about that, and maybe just even some of the seasons you've walked through with your sons.
Yeah, well, keep in mind that when your kids are little, I know you don't have kids, but when your kids are little, those are the formative years. Those are the years that you really have to help form the identity that they're trying to figure out, right? I mean, when they're toddlers, right? When they're babies, they're trying to figure out their fingers and their legs, and they're discovering parts of their body that they didn't realize were there. Like, oh my gosh, I have hair up there. Like that kind of stuff, right? Goes on. So those are all the formative years. And then when they start to become toddlers, then they're starting to figure out the walking thing, right? And you're trying to encourage them, and you're all excited about encouraging them. And then they fall and get hurt, and you want to pick them up and help them, keep pushing them along, right? Like we're still doing that stuff as when they get older, but it's just in different ways, right? Like I said, when they're toddler, they fall down and you're like, oh, okay, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. Like the moms would go, oh, honey, let me hold you. No. Let me just pick you up. You're good, kid. You're good. You got this. You can handle this, right? And then you just kind of help them along, and they figure it out. Well, once they hit the teenage years, then they're like, then the role completely changes. Then you don't know anything, right? Yep. You're the you don't know anything, Dad. You don't know anything, Mom. I know everything. That's the teenager, right? I know everything because I'm trying to figure out who I am. My identity is trying to be formed right now, and I need to know that I can be independent from you, Mom. I can be independent from you, Dad. So I always tell guys, I coach a lot of dads, and I always tell dads, listen, I know that 13, 14 years old, they do not want to see you. They do not want to hang out with you, and they do not want to talk to you. They don't want you touching them. They don't want you hugging them. They don't want you doing any of those things to embarrass them. But you have to understand that just be there. Just be there as much as you can. Talk to them as much as they'll allow you to, right? I tell my dads, just ask them questions. Just be curious in the things that they're curious in, and then you'll be able to build a better relationship with them, having the similar interests. But those years right there are tough because you've already done the formative years, right? Now you're just trying to help them understand who they are, who their identity is. And you're trying to do it in a delicate way because you don't want to overstep your boundaries because they are trying to figure this out on their own. So those roles change and it gets challenging when they're teenagers. But I always tell dads, moms too, hang on. Just buckle up because they're going to come back to you. As long as you're still around, as long as you're still kind of showing interest in them, they're going to come around and they're going to be back in your corner again. And then you're going to be able to be the advisor and the counselor and the, hey, yeah, I know exactly what you're going through. I did that too. Here's what I would do. For my boys, it was very, just like that. My boys, hey, I had a great relationship with my kids. I was always there. That was one of the reasons why I coached, because I knew I had to be there. I was their coach. They couldn't get rid of me. They couldn't say, Dad, stop, leave me alone. Well, I can't. I'm your coach, right? Yeah. So that was one of the reasons why I coached, so I could always be there. But for me, my boys had that same relationship with me. It's like I couldn't drop them off at school and give them a hug anymore. They didn't want anything to do with me, and I just had to go, okay, I understand. Just know that I love you. I hope you have a good day. Yeah. Love you too, Dad. Yeah. And they're out the door, right? Yep. Well, once they hit those pre-adult years, start to hit 17, 18, 19, now they're in the adult world, and they're trying to figure things out even more, then they start to come back to Mom and Dad and go, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know what this means. Yeah, Mom and Dad weren't so dumb after all, were we? Right? And we joke with my older son because there's a couple things that he just turned 26. And one of the things that he had to take on as a 26-year-old is I no longer can have him on my health insurance. Yep, now he's got to have his own health insurance. So he's like asking us questions going, why is this so expensive? Why do I have to pay this copay, but yet I have that I have to, this deductible that I have to take care of too? It's like, yeah, welcome to adulthood, kid, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. But now we're the advisor. Now we're the advisors. So they come to us for advice, and I give my boys advice, and I just let them take it or leave it. They can do what they want. If they want to take my advice, great. If they don't, that's fine too. Just know what you're getting. Yeah. You decided to run your own game and take your own advice or not follow my advice, then you get what you get. It could be good, could be not so good, right? So our roles as parents change. It's challenging. It can be challenging, but I promise you it's rewarding as long as you stick to it. Don't give up. You just got to stay in the fight. And one thing that I would encourage parents out there as far as those challenging times, especially when your kids start to hit those preteens and teen years, is just be that loving parent and understand that they're going through a lot of hormonal changes. They're trying to go through these identity changes where they're trying to figure out who they are or who they want to be. And the hormones will drive them crazy. And they're rediscovering who they are. And you have to allow them to do that as long as they're not putting themselves in harm's way. So if they start to get into trouble or start to go down a path that you don't need them to go down, whether it's addiction of some sort or spending too much time with the opposite sex, if you know what I mean, those kinds of things, yes, you need to kind of start to step in front there and say, listen, I'm your parent and I need to make sure you're being safe and not doing the things you shouldn't be doing. But just being there, loving on them, being as communicative as possible, making sure that you're there to listen if they just need to vent. Those kinds of things are important. And if you do those things, I promise you they'll come back around to where they're you really have a solid relationship with them when they start to hit the pre-adult and adulthood years.
I love it. So a few last questions. Once again, you've done so much time in conversations and you have so many years of knowledge that we want to extract some of that. So one of them, and you kind of mentioned it here just a minute ago, you said, hey, sometimes, one of the spouses wants to coddle the child and sometimes you just need to stand them up instead of, giving them a hug. And I think that can cause a rift in a relationship, right? One parent was maybe raised one way, the other parent was raised a different way, and all of a sudden they're trying to parent the way that they think is right, but it's not sending, the same message, and then that can be tricky. So talk a little bit about that between spouses or, significant others that are parenting together that maybe just aren't on the same wavelength of things at this point in time, and how to really talk about that.
Yeah. Well, first, you need to make sure that you're not getting frustrated or argumentative in front of the kids. I know that's plenty of people have heard that. Don't argue in front of the kids. Don't fight in front of the kids. All that kind of stuff. My wife, we're not perfect. We always made mistakes. But one of the things that we always tried to be aware of is not interacting in a negative manner in front of our kids. If we had a disagreement, one of us typically would say, hey, let's table this. This isn't going the direction that we need it to go right now. So let's go ahead and table this and we'll come back to it and talk about it later. And then you shut it down. You just don't hold grudges. You just like it never happened. And then when the kids aren't around and you can really sit down and talk about it, then you can say, hey, listen, I know my son's name. I know Blake. I know he's trying to learn how to walk. And he's falling a lot. And I know you want to be there to love on him and support him and tell him it's okay and he's not going to get hurt and all that kind of stuff. I get that. But we need to also encourage him to continue to stand up and walk, because if we're not, then he's going to rely on you too much to carry him around. He's going to be like, I can't do it. He's going to shut down. I can't do it. I'm not going to walk. I'm just going to crawl, or I'm going to lift my hands up for mom and dad to pick me up. And that's all he's going to ever know. And we have to really encourage him to walk. Now, Blake wasn't like that. Blake was walking at 9 months. Like, no joke. He was literally walking at 9 months. So we never had that issue with him. Yeah. But that was just an example. But it's those kinds of conversations you need to have as spouses, separate from the kids. Because if the kids see you as parents butting heads and having these conflicts, kids are not dumb. They are smarter than you think, and they'll use that against you either now or later. They'll use that against you in the sense that I know that I can butt mom and dad's heads against each other, and I'll eventually get my way, so I'm just going to play them both. And trust me, kids do it all the time. It will happen. I promise you. So, yeah, I mean, listen, Phil, my wife and I aren't perfect. We made plenty of mistakes as parents. There are countless times I wish I could take back on the ways that I behave towards my boys, on the ways that we behave towards our boys or towards each other in front of our boys. We weren't perfect, but we always tried to do our best, and we always tried to live a functioning life and have a happy marriage where my boys could see that and reflect on that. So they not only knew how a man should be treated by a woman, but how a woman should treat a man in a relationship.
That's really good. Now, you talked about, working a lot in your younger years, and that created, strong work ethic in you. And I think there's that tough balancing act where I think probably every parent strives to give their kids more than what they had in every opportunity and then some. And at the same token, there was something about that newspaper route that created great work ethic, right? There was something about that newspaper route that helped Bryan understand the value of money and at some point, how to spend his money. So how do you balance that, as a parent saying, hey, I want to instill some of these same life lessons that I had, but maybe not at the cost of how I had to learn them or why I had to learn them?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that there's ever a way that we can truly balance between work and family and extracurricular activities that we're doing. It's very hard to have a balanced life because here's why. Number one, if you're trying to live a balanced life, but let's say you're at your job and you're working on your business, well, if you're 100% devoted to what you're doing in your business, it's very unlikely that you're giving any time to anything else outside of the business. So the balancing act is constantly doing this. So actually living a balanced life is nearly impossible to do. So I never had a balanced life. However, the way I lived my life was whatever I'm focused in at the moment, it's going to get 100% of my attention, but I'm not going to separate that from anything else. In other words, when I'm here with on a podcast with you right now, you're getting my attention for this hour-long podcast, right? Yep. But when you and I are done, then my wife is getting my attention again, and I'm giving her 100% of my attention. So I'm trying to balance it all as best as possible. So it's very tricky to do. But what I teach my boys, or what I've taught my boys over the years, is you're going to give time to what you think is important.
Yeah.
And my boys were very committed to playing sports. They're very committed to they weren't so committed to their grades. Yeah. Although they did get good grades, but they just weren't like they weren't the all A student, you know what I mean, or the 4.5 GPA student. They just weren't those kids. But they really wanted to devote a lot of their time to sports, and I had to teach them. Listen, you're going to give 100. You're going to give where your passion is. That's where you're going to give your time.
Yeah.
And if that's what you're passionate about, then do it. They had nothing else. They had no other responsibilities other than school and sports. They had no other responsibilities they really had to worry about, right? So the one thing that I would tell parents when it comes to trying to balance your time and trying to show that to your kids is just lead by example. Yep. So if you're going to be that dad that spends 90 hours a week at the office and you're not going to spend any time with your kids, then you can't expect them to want to spend time with you. Period. Yep. They're not going to want to, they don't know you because you're never home. You're never around. But my boys know when I'm at the office, I'm there. When I'm home, I'm with them. When I'm home, I'm, as they grew up, when I'm home, I'm coaching them. When I take the days off, we're hanging out. I'm not doing other things. We're hanging out. So that was what was important to me. And that's what I did in order to show my boys how to live that life. I just led by example.
I love it. Well, Bryan, I want to say thanks so much for sharing your journey and obviously your passion with raising up the parents of today. And I think one of the things that you said was really profound is no one's going to be perfect at this parenting thing. We're just trying to do it as best as we can, right? And so everyone, go check out the Dad Up podcast, subscribe to that, and Bryan, thanks again for being on today.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it, Phil. I'm looking forward to continuing this friendship and keep doing what you're doing, brother. I mean, listen, there is a very small percentage of us out there that still have a podcast after 5 years. Most podcasts don't even make it a year. Like 99% of them don't even make it a year. And for Phil, I've been doing it over 5 years. Phil's been doing it he's been doing it longer than I have. For him to still be doing it means that he's passionate about this. And he enjoys doing what he's doing, and it's working because he's still doing it and he's successful at it. So keep doing what you're doing, brother.
Appreciate it.